Alright, so this time we're going on to a narrative question, so you can pause at any time that you need as we go through this, especially having a look at the mark scheme there. And what it amounts to is a few things that we really need to do. So for this question we absolutely need to have 3 paragraphs. It mentions being structured in a clear sequence. So we've got to link things as well. You can't just write about things in order, you've got to say, how did this thing lead to that? So 2 great phrases I would take forward and try to use as you do your practice is this led to, or this resulted in, or resulting in, that sort of thing. If you have your 3 paragraphs of a clear beginning, middle and end, you could even make it obvious and sort of say to begin with at the start of your answer, and at the very end you could say, and the end of all of this was, to make it absolutely clear. But excellent knowledge is also important, and that's why I've created this video for you. So the start of this question is 1944, and my beginning of the answer, of this narrative to explain how the Soviets took control, the first steps they took was to make sure the Nazis were removed from different countries that they were in control of, but not to just remove the Nazis and then go away again and let the country be free. So not to liberate, if we're using the proper historical terminology, simply to replace the Nazis. So countries like Poland, Hungary, so on and so forth, they thought they were being liberated in some respects, but actually all that happened is they were occupied by a different army, the Red Army. That's the Soviet Union's army. And yeah, once they're in control of a country, then they could start to establish greater control and domination of that country. And a really good example to show how the Soviets were absolutely dedicated to making sure they were in supreme control of a country in terms of being the armed force that had that power was the Warsaw Uprising. Warsaw being the capital of Poland. Some Polish people saw the writing on the wall that the Soviets might just take over Poland for themselves, so they tried to resist against the Nazis in 1944, and the Soviets actually encouraged this. They said, well, we'll send you help, yeah, don't worry. Once the Polish people rebelled against the Nazis who were in control at that time, the Soviets did nothing to help. They just sort of paused their army, let the Polish and German Polish people fight against each other, kill one another, and at the end, when the Germans beat the Polish and were left damaged, then the Soviets continued their advance. And in one action, what they were left with is control of Poland. There was no armed Polish resistance because the Germans had wiped it out. They'd easily beaten the German army back out of Poland, and the Red Army were left in control. So once the Soviets had established armed control of a region, this meant that they could then, you see this narrative linking things, this meant that they could then rig elections. So to begin with, they sort of tried to give the pretense that they weren't going to do this. They did hold some elections, for example in Hungary in 1945, and communists were quite popular in that election, but not popular enough to control everything. What the Soviets did is they then made sure they had elections, which I'm going to talk to you as more specifics afterwards, where they used intimidation or just blatant cheating and not counting votes to make sure that these elections brought back communists as in complete charge. So you have the Red Army taking control, and then you've got the power to be able to rig elections. So that would be my second paragraph. So it's all well and good to know what's going on and to link those things, but it's always great to dip some examples in there. So in Hungary, there were rigged elections in 1947. In Poland, there were also rigged elections in 1947. And in Czechoslovakia, things happened a little bit differently there. Communists took control of the police and the armed forces, overthrew the government that was there. Czechoslovakia was fairly democratic to begin with. And once they'd taken over the control of the government and the control of the police and the armed forces, we call that a coup. Looks like COUP, it's a French word, I believe. But that means that taking control by force. So once they'd taken control by force, Then they had their rigged elections. So that was a year later. But there's 3 examples there of rigged elections. So yeah, there you go. COMINFORM is the final step I would give. It's tricky, this one, because COMINFORM sort of is established in 1947 when those rigged elections were happening. But it's not like you just organise something and bam, there it is. It takes a little bit of organisation, making sure it gets going. So that's why I would put that at the end. COMINFORM, Communist Information Bureau, which is like giving out the information of here's what you must do. Moscow, the capital of the Soviet Union, is where they decided what these Eastern European satellite states had to do and how they were supposed to act. And it was COMINFORM, and they had meetings and that sort of thing. That was where they made sure the things that they wanted to happen happened in the satellite states, their puppet states, the ones they controlled. Now, some of you might remember COMINFORM and COMECON. You wouldn't include COMECON in this answer, although I'm sure many people would have done if this was a question that came up in the exam, because COMECON did not happen until 1949. Because of the narrative question in this paper, you absolutely must know your dates and have timelines. So again, to give some examples, if you want that outstanding knowledge, they wanted to ensure foreign policy aims were in line. For example, they made sure that all of the satellite states rejected Marshall aid. They also wanted to make sure that the country started to look a little bit more like the Soviet Union, so they ensured domestic policies like collectivisation of agriculture. Now, you don't need to know what that is. I'll happily tell you if you ask me, but it's a good example of a domestic policy that COMINFORM forced the satellite states to do. So these all countries become a little bit more like the Soviet Union setup and help the Soviet Union to take control of it. But also, they used COMINFORM to identify any opposition, anybody who spoke out and said, I'm not sure I agree with this, and to then get rid of them. Or the key term you could say there is to purge. So the Soviets used COMINFORM to identify opposition and to purge them from the satellite states. That would be the little phrase I would put in there. And there you go, the 3 stages of the Soviet establishment of satellite states is the Red Army established control, so they can then do what they were like in those countries. There's rigged elections, and once you've got control of the armed forces, control of the government, then you establish greater control with COMINFORM, where you then make those governments do what you want them to do and act in a way that you would like them to act. And those are the 3 stages, and hopefully you can see how one thing led to another, enough to be able to put into your exam. You take control with the Soviet army, giving you complete control, so that then you can rig elections to take control of the government. Once you have control of the government and the armed forces, or like your armed forces are in control of the country, then you can establish your own policies in that country. Those are the three sections. Hopefully that's made sense to you, but if not, you are welcome to drop me an email. If you want to prepare for the next question, you can see it on the screen there. And also, if you want to ask me if there's any specific things you want me to go through, just drop me an email. That's all. Thank you.